is we'll do a different kind of a session. We'll try to do a jugalbandi of sorts, where we'll try to discuss some geopolitical issues and take views of all three of us on the major issues facing here. So to just start off with, it's quite surreal, right, that geopolitics is being discussed at a finance related discussion, right? We've probably reached that period where, you know, in this month alone, just see the kind of things that have happened. The US Department of Defense has invested, taken equity stake in a mining minerals firm, MP Materials, which is quite unusual. China maintains a lot of export controls on rare earths, tunnel boring machines, really basic things like rare earth magnets, etc. And on the other hand, you are also seeing India talking about we should do something related to semiconductors, etc., for national security reasons. So it's quite a change from where we were earlier, right? Earlier, the idea was comparative advantage, the longer the supply chains, the better, the more resilient. But we have now reached a period which I call Uber Matsyanaya, right? Like what Kautilya talks about, Matsyanaya, big fish eat small fish. That's the world that we were in geopolitics itself. And that's where we are now. So we'll be discussing a lot of things related to geopolitics and how do they play out here, how can they affect businesses, etc. So let's begin right up front on that. And Shekhar, I wanted to begin with of course, the Nobel-sized ego question about how what's going to happen with US, India going ahead? What are some of the trends that you are looking out for? And what are some of the trends that people here should look out for, right? Because 50% tariffs, you know, as I think if Ravi Shastri were observing this, he would say something's got to give, right? Too much, it's a too high a tariff to be maintained. So how do you see this going out? What are some trends that you are looking out for?
Well, first of all, on tariffs, the question is, what does it cost Trump? Because what has been tariffed, none of that is something which is irreplaceable or which the Americans can do without. And those who buy gems and jewelry, maybe they can afford to pay more, and our people will also charge less, they'll cut their profits. So I think this is, these tariffs on India are zero cost to Trump. And humongous cost to India, because this literally means the loss of several millions of jobs. Because these are your fishermen, these are your weaving and hosiery labor, these are your gems and jewelry people. This really hits you where it hurts. So when Navarro writes that we've hit India where it hurts, he's right. And he cannot do the same thing to China, because Chinese have stuff that he cannot do without. What he cannot do without, he has not tariffed. That is pharmaceuticals. That he hasn't tariffed, at least not yet. So I don't think that he has much of a need purely on this basis. In fact, don't be surprised, because it's Trump, you're dealing with Trump. Don't be surprised if a week later, 10 days later, if he thinks you are still not showing him what he sees as respect, he might up it to 100%. Although between 25% and 100%, he can make it 500%. It doesn't matter. And he doesn't care about gutting America's relations with India. Because he has, he has declared a new world order. This is the world order with three powers: America, China, and Russia. And in his view, the three should not be fighting. The three should carve up their own spheres of influence, and all the rest are then on their own, including Europe. So the earlier idea that there were two big powers, one really big power, second rising in challenge, and a tussle between them, a declining Russia, and in the process, then you saw a lot of space for swing states. So India was a swing state, Turkey was a swing state, Saudi Arabia is a swing state, Brazil is a swing state. So in the Trumpian worldview, the swing state will be marginalized. I'm not saying he'll be successful. I am trying to read his mind if such a thing is possible. But American power will remain American power. American markets will remain American markets. And I think he's also coming at you with some feeling in the mega base that Indians have done too well. I think all this exaggerated celebration of Indians, the richest minority, Indians, the model minority, so many Indian CEOs, etc., etc. What is the mega base? Mega base is the white Americans who believe they've been left out, right? Uh, so Indians have drawn their attention. And so see that one line that Lutnick spoke, I think in his interview with the CNBC, he said that at the White House dinner, I asked Mr. Modi that you say you have such a big economy, you are growing so fast, and you still can't afford to buy 1 bushel of American corn, right? So you can see where they are coming from. So I think at some point, an opportunity has to arise where Mr. Modi and Trump take each other aside and say, bahut ho gaya, let's see what way we can find around it. But the problem in India is that unlike most countries, and don't blame democracy, all of Europe is democracy. In our country, everything gets, and this is also specifically applicable to the Modi-style politics. Everything is embedded in domestic politics. So when you embed everything in domestic politics, that constricts your room for maneuver. Because then what do you say? That's why our Prime Minister has to come and say in Parliament about J.D. Vance's call. मैं कहीं और था, commanders के साथ था. मैं आया तो मुझे मालूम पड़ा कि 2-3 बार वो कॉल कर चुके हैं. तो मैंने कॉल करके पूछा, भाई क्या बात है? So, he's calling on behalf of President Trump. But there is a compulsion in India to look anti-American. There is a compulsion in India not to look like you are submitting to anybody. So all of that, all of those things, he has to maneuver through. Dr. Manmohan Singh said to George Bush, he could get away with it. He said, Mr. Bush, President Bush, people of India love you greatly after the nuclear deal, right? I don't think it's easy for a really popular prime minister with a base to say so.
But Modi said, "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar," right? So,
well, that was a long time back, and Trump sarkar did not come after that. That was a long time back. Look, when you are a big power, then you don't say thank you for favors in the past. What Trump would remember is that while he was out of power, Prime Minister Modi went to the US 3 times or 4 times. He didn't get a phone call. And the last time, just before the election campaign, he said, my friend Modi is coming, I'll be meeting him. So a meeting didn't happen and a phone call didn't happen because apparently the embassy said that you must meet Kamala Harris also. And it looks like Kamala Harris did not want particularly to meet. So that is how we got caught. So Trump is a sui generis phenomenon. The fact is that Trump will go. Trump is not there forever. Even he is also not saying anymore that I will have a 3rd term. So he will go. And with luck, by next year, end of next year, he will be a lame duck. So everybody has to handle this situation. And that's what the Europeans are doing. That's why they're sitting in front of him, because they want to buy time.
yeah, so the Nobel Peace Prize declaration happens in October, I think. So there are still a couple of months. Anything on that you think India should do or shouldn't do?
I think India can write a recommendation to the Nobel Committee to give him the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing about peace between Cambodia and Thailand.
Okay, good one. All right. So Manoj, what do you think about the same topic? Where does India-US relations go from here?
Yeah, I think that, I want to begin. You started with a cricketing analogy. We just had the India-England Test series. And there was a controversy in Manchester over Ben Stokes wanting to shake hands and the Indians not wanting to shake hands. And a lot of us saw it from a transactional perspective that, he wanted to deny the Indian duo of Washington Sundar and Ravindra Jadeja their centuries. I would say that's where we begin. I look at Ben Stokes and I say what he was acting out of was ideology, was a sense of this is how things should be. And I think that is our starting point of failure in understanding what's happened in America in the last year or so. if you go back to November after Trump's election, there was an understanding in India that, look, we know how to deal with Trump. We've dealt with him in the past. Trump 1.0 was not bad for us. We'll deal with him now. He's transactional. And yes, he is transactional, but he is riding a different base, which is quite complex. It's not, yes, the white disenfranchised individuals who feel disenfranchised are his base, but there is also Latinos, there are also others. And I think that the base is much more diverse, and it has its own different elements of interests. And there is an ideology at the core of it, which he articulates when he says things like, the world has taken us for a ride. He's had an affinity for tariffs for decades. But when he says that the world has taken us for a ride, it's not just him. It's many others within his new cabinet, his vice president and others. So there is this undercurrent that he is riding on. And I think we missed that ideological undercurrent, that there is a desire to reshape the world because you feel that the world has taken America for a ride. The merits of that situation is separate. So I think that was our first failure, where we didn't understand the value of ideology on economic issues. And I think if anybody follows China, you understand the value of ideology on economic issues. I think the other areas where we failed in some ways was the idea that we put too much stake in rational interests. We put too much stake in the belief that a shared concern with regard to China binds these two countries together. That still exists, but there are frictions there. And we put too much stake in personal diplomacy. Where we go from here, I think I agree to the extent that I don't think we need to rush into a deal. There's going to be a cost. They are clear that there's going to be a cost imposed. If the cost, and our estimates tell us that the cost is going to be about 0.5% of GDP in some ways. Now doesn't sound like a large number, but like Shekhar said, there's an employment effect and so on and so forth. So I think we need to prepare for dealing with that cost. Several steps can be taken to deal with that cost. If it could be direct support in terms of unemployment, it could be support in terms of diversification of markets. So there are several things that you can do, but there will be a hit. And we have to figure out how do we deal with that hit. One way to negotiate is to continue to negotiate without necessarily giving up on what are your bottom lines. So look at Europe. Look at South Korea. South Korea's bottom lines is rice and other agricultural products. They didn't give that up for the deal with the US. But they've gotten a deal with the US at 15%. Right? Europe hasn't given up some of its bottom lines while it continues to work on security issues with the US. So I think that you can have a conversation of a deal. But what you might need to do is what these other countries did, what America's allies did, Europe, Japan, South Korea, which is they sweeten the pot and they enlarge the pot. They sweeten the pot by putting in investments in America, commitments of investments in America. When they will emerge, we'll see. And whether they are new investments, we'll see. And secondly, they try to expand the basket of negotiation. So in India, maybe we can expand the basket of negotiation, right? We can have a different conversation on energy, for instance. And we should be looking at more such components where we can expand the basket of negotiation so that if we don't want to necessarily concede on some areas which we feel are critical for us, for example, agriculture, although my views on that are different, maybe we can expand the basket and avoid the hit on those areas.
Right. Yeah. Just to add on this, yeah, like you said, energy, maybe the fact that last budget, the idea of small modular reactors was mentioned, that might be one way to get something from the US, some purchase commitments, which turns their behavior. The other point I wanted to mention is one real factor that you alluded to is US-China relations. So we have to see whether the Xi and Trump meeting happens, because that will be a big factor in how these things go ahead. And just to add to that, like you mentioned, the Section 232 exempts some things for Europe and others. So maybe at least in the short term, we would want to have a lot of things which are of importance to us, electronics, pharma, which largely constitute around 30 to 40% of our exports to US, are at least in that exemption area so that the short-term repercussions are less. And then hopefully we can sign a deal. Probably that would be one of the ways forward. But happy to also take questions. We'll have around 10 minutes for questions. So let me now move to the next part. Obviously, the next big issue is China, right? So let me begin with you, Manoj, on this. So obviously, now recently there's a lot of sentiment that the reset has been reached and India, China will again become together, there'll be great things. Today, the Chinese ambassador also mentioned that, what happened with India was not correct and we support India's stance. The bully should be paid back in the same coin, things like that. So what's the realistic assessment from your end? How does India-China relationship go here in terms of trade, investment, people flows? How do you see it?
So I've spent the last few days, ever since the Chinese foreign minister visited India, talking about this, thinking about it endlessly. I've probably lost a lot of sleep trying to do that. And after you think about something so much, eventually you end up getting poetic about it. So I'm going to phrase the structural challenges within the India-China relationship with a brief couplet. I'm an amateur poet, although a terrible one, but bear with me. प्यास तो उनकी भी है गहरी, चाह तो हमारी भी है शदीद. प्यास तो उनकी भी है गहरी, चाह तो हमारी भी है शदीद. पर क्या करे फितरत कुछ ऐसी है सागर की कि पानी हमेशा खारा है.
Wow, wow, wow.
So the challenge is that this is a structural relationship which is structurally difficult, right? There are factors like India and China are both neighboring countries, but both are rising powers. In their rise, what has happened is that their interest, if you think of them as concentric circles, coincide and intersect, and therefore there is friction over there. China's engagement in our neighborhood and our engagement, say, with the Philippines, in the South China Sea, with Vietnam, irks China. So there is this structural friction that exists. And this exists because India's interests are in that region, right? About 55% of our trade passes through the South China Sea. Both sides have grown, but there is an asymmetry. An asymmetry in power, which is reflective in economics, but which is also reflected in terms of military capacity. Although in the military domain, you can blunt that asymmetry in different ways. But what the asymmetry does is that it often creates a perception of one being greater than the other. And if China believes, like it does, that it's a major power and India is an inferior regional power, then why would it want to accommodate an inferior regional power? So that creates a dynamic of friction which is inherent in the relationship. And thirdly, of course, US policy, right? And China views India from an American lens frequently, and therefore it will coerce us to try and make sure that we don't necessarily lean too close to the United States. These are structural dynamics. They are not going to go away anytime soon. That said, this recent engagement since October last year to today, there are some really positive outcomes from this. The meeting between the foreign ministers and the special representatives, I think those were positive meetings. We've seen steps being taken forward. I think India and China should be engaging in deeper people-to-people engagement. I think India should open up much more from its information ecosystem to its visas to air connectivity. We should be proactive in doing that. At the same time, we should be proactive in accepting Chinese investment. So there are deals perhaps to be made on that. However, when you accept Chinese investment, you need to firewall certain sectors which you think are critical to national security. You can't have blanket scrutiny on every investment. So you need to have an investment scrutiny mechanism which is clear, which is transparent, where there is at least clarity for the investor what they are doing and when these deals are going to get cleared. So, and it doesn't matter if it's Chinese money or American money. That mechanism should look at all money, particularly around critical sectors. Finally, on trade, you need to have trade. Trade with China is critical for India's manufacturing growth. The fact that today India is a massive mobile phone exporter is because we are buying components and parts from China and because we have Chinese entities also present in India making products. So we should be open to trade. Of course, there are challenges with the deficit and those need to be addressed. And hopefully this process moves forward to that. My final point on this is that while these are positive outcomes, there are always going to be sources of friction even in the sort of micro sense. China has built a really smart, and it's evolving, a really smart system of economic coercion. This goes beyond export controls. It includes things like an unreliable entities list, something like the US has. And it includes, of course, ad hoc non-tariff barriers that it will use. So there is a process by which if it wants, and if it is dominant in a particular sector, understanding that Indian industry or others are dependent on that, it can use those as knobs, where it can turn the knob up, it can turn the knob down, and it can put pressure on you, use them for political purposes. So business in India should be ready and understanding that this is something that is likely to happen as the relationship is structurally very, very difficult. At the same time, you will get certain deals that you can, and potentially we can negotiate on areas like pharmaceuticals and other areas, and maybe cut some deals in the process. But if you're thinking that this is a strategic reset, and that because we are losing the American market because of tariffs of certain product, Chinese demand will replace them, that's a complete misnomer. It's never going to happen. look at the India-China trade sheet, and what you will see is that India's trade with China is growing, but India's exports to China are shrinking. In the 7 months of this year, Indian exports to China have fallen by 15%. China itself is struggling internally because of lack of demand. So you're not going to meet demand by shifting over there.
Yeah, and we also had this idea, some people thought that BRICS can be enough of a sink because the US market is going, but all BRICS, India's all exports to all BRICS combined is still less than what we sell to the US. So still less. So Shekhar, what is your take? How do you see India-China?
This BRICS is a joke, right? It's a joke. It's a joke on India most of all. Because within BRICS, at least 2 countries are tied together. That's Russia and China. Brazil is run by an ideological government, which has its view on the world, right? He's the last socialist in the world. Plus, if I may say so, if any Lula fans here, my apologies, he's losing it, right? Everybody knows that Lula's losing it right now. So BRICS is something that somebody in Goldman Sachs thought of, and then because BRIC didn't sound good enough, they added poor South Africa, right? There's nothing in common between the 4, nothing. And then I see a lot of fantasy on Indian social media, etc., and Indian hard right. There will be a BRICS currency. What's a BRICS currency? 80% of the BRICS GDP is Chinese GDP. So BRICS currency will be yuan. Are you then going to de-dollarize and shift to renminbi yuan? No such thing is going to happen. It's a joke. It's a good forum where your leaders can meet. So Xi Jinping and Modi can meet, who otherwise don't often meet. It's a place, it will take place in a place where Putin can travel, right? Not South Africa, he can't travel because they say they will implement the ICC warrant. So the India-China issues are deeper. And the deeper issues are not going to go away. China doesn't need to make up with you strategically because China knows that whatever your claims on your map, Aksaichen, etc., you are not coming to take it. In fact, your Home Minister made one statement while moving that August 5, 2019 amendment on Kashmir, and he said, Aksaichen ko hum leke aayenge, apni jaan de denge, right? That is the day that I told my friends in the government that you watch out, the Chinese are coming, right? That was August, so summer had ended, right? They waited for the winter to pass, and April, as the snows melted, they were sitting in East Ladakh. What did they come to say? They came to say that, look, if you've changed the status of Kashmir and you made this claim on Aksaichen, remember, you changed the status of Ladakh. Aksaichen on your map is a part of Ladakh. So they actually, Ashwin sitting there, they threw a strategic dusra at you by saying that you might think that Kashmir issue is bilateral between India and Pakistan. We are also party to it, right? Because we are in Aksaichen and you say it's your territory. So by coming to Ladakh, they made that point and they haven't gone away as yet. Now what's happened as a result? Militarily, India stood up to them, as Manoj says. India can stop them. It will be very expensive for them to take any territory from India. Very expensive, right? And for the Chinese to lose people after 2 generations of single-child families is going to be very tough. So India will lose a lot, but the Chinese they will lose a lot more than the Russians have per square kilometer that they take. But India cannot achieve anything militarily with China. So what the Chinese will then do is, they'll keep you busy. You've moved an entire strike corps, which was earmarked for Pakistan, for the planes, 33 corps. You've moved the entire strike corps with all your best tanks, your armored personnel carriers, your best artillery to East Ladakh. They are sitting there now. So the Pakistanis now think on the ground they have near parity, right? So you're missing that one strike corps. That's why the important thing in the latest round is that finally both sides are talking of de-escalation. De-escalation means you can start pulling some of these things back because India needs them. There is not one more T-90 tank available anywhere because Russians have burnt up most of them in Ukraine, right? So nobody has anything to spare. So Chinese know all that. So they've pinned you down. I mean, in the past, we used to say that India has done the anti-China alliance a favor by pinning so many of the Chinese down. But now they've pinned you down. And if they let you go, they know that that is leverage that they can use. So in the latest joint statement, I'm enthused by one thing, which is something that India was resisting so far, which is to say that we'll set up groups and look at some early harvest on border demarcation. Earlier, India did not want it. India said we want a package deal on the entire border. Early harvest means that at least in Sikkim now, you can demarcate your borders because there's no dispute there. And the two sides exchanged maps when they resumed trade. I mean, this will just take a minute, but with China, it's tough to deal with China. Mr. Vajpayee used to say, आप और हम जब negotiate करते हैं, हम कहते हैं मुझे ये दे दो, आप कहते हैं नहीं दूंगा. हम कहते हैं दे दो यार, आप कहते हैं नहीं दूंगा. फिर कहते हैं आप दे दो यार, फिर जो थोड़ा सा ले लो. Chinese ऐसे कभी नहीं करते हैं. Right? They tire you out. So 2003, when India said Tibet is a sovereign, autonomous, and China has sovereignty over Tibet autonomous territory, right? That was a step forward. The Chinese did not say Sikkim is a part of India because since 1975, they had not accepted Sikkim as a part of India. They said, we will start trade in Sikkim across Nathula Pass. This is our point, this is your point, and let's both exchange maps. So the two countries exchanged maps. That from the Indian side was Chinese acceptance of Sikkim as a part of India. In 2005, when this agreement, which has now been referred to, was signed, that is when the Chinese changed their maps and showed Sikkim as a part of India. So with China, it's a very slow, painstaking process. There, India said, no early harvest. We'll do the big deal. Now they're saying early harvest. India said early harvest. I see that as progress because Sikkim is very critical for us because Sikkim overlooks the Siliguri corridor, right? So this early harvest, and maybe after that you can go to the central sector, Himachal and Uttarakhand, which has very small areas of trouble, and then move on from there. So I think the Chinese have no particular urgency to militarily de-escalate, except they also want their troops back. Why should they have 100,000 people sitting up at 17,000 feet? But otherwise, they will keep fighting you through Pakistan. So in fact, I wrote after this Op Sindoor that what we've seen in Op Sindoor is the first round of our two-front warfare. It was a two-front war, but fought only on one front. And Chinese can keep fighting like that. They will fight with you anytime like that. That's the reason the first thing India must do is what Europe is now paying for not doing, which is not investing in defense. India has not invested in defense. Last 11 years under Mr. Modi, India's defense budget as a percentage of GDP is lower than it was under UPA. Also, because it was an election promise, he gave OROP. So the pension budget now is much more than the salary budget, which is much more than the budget available for military development. So all of those things, I think India's world has changed. And the arrival of Trump 2.0 has taken away that earlier assurance. The last round of scraps with the Chinese in 2020, Americans made so much geospatial intelligence and information available to India. With the Trump lot, I don't know. He doesn't even have an NSA. He has gutted his National Security Council. Today, as we are talking, he's raided John Bolton, right? At 7 a.m., he's raided him. That is almost like he's taken a leaf out of our book, right? Because he gave 2 interviews criticizing Trump for the crime of criticizing Trump. I think our Chief Minister of Assam should also haul him up, file an FIR against him. Yeah. So this is a different world. The Chinese want their trade in India. They want this surplus. They also, maybe they want their troops back. And I think they are now reassured that they can have the Chinese balance us at least for the next few years. Sorry, the Pakistanis balance us for the next few years.
Right. Yeah, so many interesting points. Yeah, defense, absolutely. Now, defense expenditure is below 2% of GDP, and it has been
For
the
11
past.
years.
No, now, yeah, less than 2% GDP over the last 2 years. And what we are seeing is related to China, I think, on the trade and investment, because that is also a relevant point. Jake Sullivan, the former NSA of US, had this idea of small yard, high fence, right? That in some sectors there will be high barriers for China, but other than that, it should be low. It didn't work out for the US, but I think that as an approach is probably good for us when dealing with China, to say that there are certain sectors where we already have export capacity and capability. There we need to be aware of Chinese overcapacity dumping, and there probably some sort of countervailing tariffs might make sense. But and then the other angle is strategic sectors. So you don't want TikTok, for example. That was a good move, I think, because TikTok, for example, is influencing a lot of things in Taiwan, and that's a risk. But other than that, most of the sectors, we do need a recoupling. And Manoj, you mentioned about electronics. Written about this, why India needs a recoupling with Chinese electronics industry for our own sake. And that did happen with Apple supplier coming, and it has benefited us. So that did go to the right way. Now let's go to the next question, and this is the last one, and then we'll take audience questions as well. So obviously the third player we have to talk about. Earlier we thought, even the government thought, you can ignore that player, but turns out you can't ignor that player, and it is Pakistan. And given what has happened, and Shekhar, you have written a lot about this recently, about how Op Sindoor panned out. So where do you see this relationship going? Now, on one side, Field Marshal Asim Munir is going and saying India is a Mercedes and we are like a dump truck. And on the other side, you are also seeing a lot of rhetoric about they'll go nuclear. So what is your assessment? How should people think about it?
Well, you can't ignore Pakistan ever. At the same time, while we complain that we don't want to be hyphenated with Pakistan, right now we have ourselves fully hyphenated ourselves with Pakistan. See any speech of the Prime Ministers in public which does not mention Pakistan. There was a long time when we had started to ignore Pakistan, right? Because what is Pakistan? People tell me...
A dump truck, according to their field marshals.
Pardon me?
A dump truck, according to their field marshals.
A dump truck, that's also because there is a great sense of envy and jealousy in Pakistan at how India has grown. That's why that Surah Fil and a picture of Mukesh Ambani. So Surah Fil is a verse that is the story of, in a battle, Allah sending mythical birds that drop stones over the enemy's elephants, and elephants turn to burnt straw, right? So they put that surah and Mukesh Ambani's picture. That was during Op Sindoor. Yeah. Where is it coming from? It's coming from this deep sense of envy that these guys have gone ahead, we've got left behind, and the gap between us and them is growing. So ideologically, whatever else, to put it as simply as possible, Pakistan sees its power as a nuisance state. As a state that can ruin India's happiness, that can ruin the world's happiness. He's lying that if we think we are going down, we'll take half the world with us, right? So, as Steve Cohen used to say, Pakistan negotiates with the world by putting the gun to its own head. But the fact is, you can't get rid of Pakistan. It will always be there. So, you have to have a short-term plan, a long-term plan, and who knows what happens in the future. But you have to also inside yourself acknowledge the fact that Pakistan is militarily very strong, right? Obviously we are much stronger than them, but Pakistan is not pushover. And Pakistan has very limited strategic objectives. For us, we have to think of Pakistan, we have to think of China, we have to think of the vast coastline, we think we can block the Malacca Strait, right? Pakistan has no such clutter. They are there only to spoil India's lunch. That is the only thing that matters to them. And Pakistani army has an ideology and a mindset. And that has become worse now because Munir, most people don't realize it, Munir is the first officer to become chief who was hired under Zia, in Zia era. So this in Pakistani discourse, they are called Zia Bharti. So people who joined the army as cadets during Zia-ul Haq, because that was the era of Islamization. And that's when he brought the Maulvis into training academies, etc., made them part of their regiment. So even the next several chiefs will be Zia Bharti. And the nature of Pakistani polity, when I have always said that there is a global vested interest, shared vested interest in changing the essential nature of Pakistani polity, right? And that's where India can get others together. And that's where Indian leaders have been able to get others together. But now, if you make Pakistan so central to your own politics at home, because Pakistan equals terrorism, equals Muslim, which means you know what, right? Then it gives Pakistan leverage in your politics, which we should not be giving to Pakistan. We should not invite Pakistan to our political table. But who listens to columnists?
Yeah, thanks so much. Manoj, you have anything to add on this?
Just a couple of points. On the China-Pakistan equation, I think as much as there is a congruence of interests with regard to India among them, I think it's also useful for us to keep in mind that there are also differences in that relationship. There are divisions in that relationship. There is mistrust in that relationship too, for all the milk and honey proximity that they have. Pakistan it's an extremely promiscuous client state, which has at present two patrons, the United States and China. And wants
Saudi Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia, yes, but those are its two sort of bigger strategic patrons. And it's trying to cultivate the US also further. I think the Chinese also feel anxiety with regard to that. The Chinese feel anxiety with regard to their investments in Pakistan and the security of their investments in Pakistan. The Chinese feel anxiety with regard to being played by Pakistan. Their biggest concern is that they land up with Pakistan in a situation where the tail starts to wag the dog. And I think that anxiety is something that is in their head, which we must keep in mind as we engage with China. It's not necessarily, and China has shown this, right? When the time is right and when it serves their interests, they have been very willing to whip the dog. They have been very willing to punish Pakistan, and the FATF is an example of that in the past. So I think that we need, as much as I agree with everything that you've said in terms of the relationship and its proximity and its strategic alignment with regard to India, I think these differences are useful for us to keep in mind while we talk to the Chinese also.
Yeah, and the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the loan rates for them are quite high. And that is also fear for China that that plan is not going as they wish to. Okay, so now we can take a few questions. We have around 8 minutes.
Can I ask him a question?
Yeah.
Since you are a specialist. So Donald Trump wants critical minerals in Pakistan. These are in the same areas where the Chinese are operating. So you think Chinese will just look the other way as the Americans come and mine
Not at all.
critical minerals and copper at Reko Diq?
There is a reason why the Chinese foreign minister spent so much time in Afghanistan and Pakistan this time, having these trilaterals and these bilaterals. At the heart of all of this is minerals. So the Chinese will not let it go. And that's why if you look at what Wang Yi said while in Pakistan yesterday, one of his arguments was that, look, we want to be the big power in South Asia, and our relationships will be... In Pakistan, he talked about the China-India relationship, saying that is a relationship which is not targeting a third party. He never does that he's never done that in the past. So there is a sense that China wants to have a certain degree of stability, and because it wants to exploit these opportunities and not let them be to the Americans.
And critical minerals, the average age for starting a mine is 16 years. So it's a pie in the sky, or probably even farther than that. All right, so any questions? I see a hand raised here. Yeah, please.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Our team will come to you with the mic. Yeah. Please identify yourself, and then if you have a specific question.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes, please. If you don't mind, if
Yeah.
you can, please. Yes.
Shubhada Rao here. I just wanted to ask a question. In this dangerous, emerging, chaotic world order, should nuclear threat be so casually dropped? How should one perceive this? A very casual dropping of nuclear threat.
Well, the Pakistanis have always done it. Pakistanis have always done it. India has called that bluff again and again. Say, nuclear weapon is the losing side's weapon. So Pakistan always starts out because they work with the presumption that conventionally they will lose, particularly if it goes long enough. It's also their way of attracting international attention. So that's what Trump says now, that they were going to go nuclear. Nobody was going to go nuclear. But he said they were going to go nuclear and everybody would have suffered. And I'm quite sure the Pakistanis played the nuclear card with the Americans and it worked with them. Because after their air bases got hit on the 10th, then they knew it's a humiliation. Because you can claim you shot down 20 Indian aircraft, but nobody's seen them. Jungle mein mor nacha kisne dekha? But your bust up air bases, all your people have seen. Pictures the whole world has seen, but your people live there. All the videos that we have of missiles striking their air bases have come from their people. You can hear them talking in Punjabi, right? And these are in Punjab. Every air base east of the Indus was struck. At least one air base west of the Indus, which is Jacobabad, was struck. And remember, during the Afghan war, Jacobabad air base was outsourced or rented to the Americans. So the American air operations there were being carried out from Jacobabad. So they knew that everything, it goes on for one more day. All the bases west of the Indus will also be hit and people will watch it. I think that is when they told the Americans that, look, we are now beyond our threshold. We don't have anything else, so we will use tactical nuclear weapons. Maybe this, and that is when I'm now just interpreting. Prime Minister also said, J.D. Vance said कि उन्होंने कहा वो बहुत भारी हमला करने वाले हैं. वो बहुत भारी हमला का मतलब यही था that they wanted to suggest, and maybe Trump bought this googly because it suited Trump. It suited Trump to say this was going to go nuclear because it checks one more box on his Nobel application. Because he's Nobel obsessed, because Obama got it, he must get it.
Yeah.
So in fact, Asim Munir apne aap ko, he's given himself the second highest gallantry award in Pakistan, Mahavir Chakra.
Yeah.
Field Marshal, he doesn't go into, but he's given it to himself. He gave himself a 5th star. So my point is के साथ एक Nobel Prize Trump को दे दे और एक अपने आप को भी दे दे, है ना? तो सारी प्रॉब्लम खत्म हो जाएगी दुनिया की. So this is Pakistanis play the nuclear card all the time. They have nuclear weapons. They are an unstable state in many ways. We can't wish them away. As Vajpayee said, you can't choose your neighbors.
Yeah.
Can I just respond to her with one sentence? So your question was whether something ought to be done. Questions, those are questions of norms. Norms matter when when we had a rules-based order. The order, and that I think makes the broader point. When we are in an order, it no longer matters what you ought to do, it matters what you can and cannot do. And that's, I think, the shift that we also need to internalize in the world.
Yeah, and I would add, even Putin mentioned this, right? It was before Munir, and yeah, it's a great point that actually nuclear risk has increased. There is a bulletin of atomic scientists, or atomic clock, which shows that we are close to nuclear midnight. So in the sense, it's good that we at least think about this. So our position has been that probably the idea of a global nuclear no first use should be thought about. Now it seems up in the air because of the way world is opening, but it is a threat and it should be discussed. It's really important. Yeah, here.
Yeah, hi. Hi, my name is Bharat. Two questions. One, could you talk about the long-term economic impact on Russia from this war? And second, like ASEAN, there's a lot of economic integration in Southeast Asia. Do you think there's any hope for the Indian subcontinent for similar, cooperation, economic cooperation and trade?
Shekhar, you want to take the Russia question? Impact on Russia of the war.
Well, I don't have too much reading except from Western media. And I know that Russian economy has suffered greatly. But what is the Russian economy? Russian economy is a resource-based economy. So once there is peace. Now, Trump has basically conceded most of Russia's terms for peace in Ukraine. So if there is peace in Ukraine, then sanctions will be lifted. Sanctions will be lifted. Russia can again start pulling out the resources and selling them all over the world. So Russia is not an economic power. Russia's GDP today is just a bit more than half of India's GDP. So Russia is economically very weak. Russia has an aging population. It also has a declining population. So Russia has many, many, many challenges. But if the war ends, Russia can rebuild its economy around its resources because it's got them. It's got the technology to pull them out. It's got a lot of uranium, palladium. It's not just oil, titanium. That's why Russian aircraft are so heavy and so strong because they use so much titanium there. Russia has its strengths. That's as much as I know.
On the subcontinent question, no. We're not going to see that level of integration for many, many reasons. Our inter-subcontinent, India's trade with its neighbors is about 2.some%. It's been that way for the longest time. India is the largest economy, but there are deep political frictions that exist with each of our neighbors. And India is at the heart of this region, so everything connectivity has to happen through India. So it's not going to happen, at least in the near future, as far as I can see. So I wanted to answer that question briefly because I wanted to pose one last question to Pranay, because it would be a travesty if we end without having Pranay talk about technology. He's probably the best person in this country who understands the geopolitics of technology, so it would be a travesty if you don't hear him. So Pranay, I wanted a brief thought from you about how do we think about the geopolitics of technology? Trump wants to sell H20 chips, Biden didn't want to sell them. Trump today wants to flood the market with these chips. India, we want certain kinds of technology, but we don't have access to them. We're dependent on China for things like semiconductors. How do we make sense of what's happening in the world of technology? And is AI going to transform everything, or it's a buzzword?
Yeah, lots of things there. But I'll quick 2-3 points on this before we end. So first thing is lots of governments have internalized that technology will be a greater proportion of national power, and hence you're seeing the kind of investments that are happening in this, right? Even India, for example, we said defense expenditure is less than 2% GDP, but the government is willing to commit things for semiconductor fabs, quantum, etc., right? So what you're seeing, a lot of nation states will try to build some base capabilities in a lot of technology domains. And a lot of this is not necessarily driven by market demand, but it is a national security demand which is coming in. So that's why you're building fabs in many places, even though they are not economical. So that is one. Second thing is, in times of technological and geopolitical contestation, we always see some non-linear breakthroughs. So when the Sputnik moment happened, US changed things. US formed NASA, US formed NSF, lots of things happened and new things happened. Similarly, when the Japan-US contest happened, some things new happened. Now also you're seeing just how when H20 chips were blocked, and before that other chips were blocked, China tried to get DeepSeek out, and now open source is a way to go forward, right? So we'll see some non-linear breakthroughs. And the third point is, even though we might see some of these things, the big difference between old tech and new tech is that the role of commercial players is a lot more now compared to what it was in the past. Earlier, space, nuclear, largely made locally, and your customer is also the government. But now, as if you are NVIDIA, the only way you make money is you sell billions of chips to lots of commercial players, make money and reinvest into R&D. So if you look at it, it's not just US versus China. It is US and US companies, China and Chinese companies, India, Indian companies, etc. So they are a vital player, and some companies will probably be able to resist some of the things, but most of the companies you will see aligning more with their national governments rather than earlier. So anyways, from the Indian perspective, plurilateralism is a necessity, not a choice in some of these domains. So we will have to collaborate on a few things and build base capabilities in others, and finally, at least identify some areas in the supply chains where we have an asymmetric advantage so that we can at least have some leverage against other nation states. That's where I'll put it. I think we are out of time, so we'll end this. I hope this was of interest, given this geopolitics has entered so many conversations now. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.